My name is Bree. I'm 35 years old. And the night I came home from grief group, I found out my husband's death wasn't the only loss I was about to face. My parents, both in their 70s, were sitting on the curb outside my house, their suitcases at their feet, shivering in the early fall chill. My mother's hands, stiff with arthritis, clutched the blanket a neighbor had brought out. My father, still fragile after heart surgery last year, looked pale, lips blue, his breath short. When I ran to them in shock, I thought maybe there'd been a break-in. But then my mother whispered the words that made my blood run cold. They changed the locks, sweetheart. Through the windows of the home my late husband Kieran and I had built together, I could see lights blazing, shadows moving, voices laughing. And then I recognized them, his parents. The same parents who never came to our wedding, who barely called during his chemo, who always poured their love and money into his younger brother Kurt, the golden child who'd burned through marriages, jobs, and chances like cigarettes. While I sat in a circle of other widows trying to piece my heart back together, they had marched into my home, shoved my elderly parents out, and claimed the house as if my husband's death had made me invisible. That night wasn't just about locks on doors. It was about power. About entitlement. About a family who thought they could erase me the way they erased their own son's sacrifices. But they were wrong. Because grief might have broken me, but it also woke something inside me that they weren't prepared for. Before I tell you how I made sure they never hurt my parents again, and how I took back everything they tried to steal, I want to ask you. Have you ever had someone try to take what wasn't theirs, just because they thought you were too broken to fight back? Drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe, because this isn't just a story about loss. It's the night I stopped being their victim. I met Kieran on a Tuesday that smelled like rain and printer toner. I'd taken the late train into the city for a client presentation, shoes still new enough to bite, blazer borrowed from my mom because navy photographs better than black, Bree. Afterward, the sky broke open over Midtown, and everyone did that New York thing where you pretend you're not drenched. I ducked into a coffee shop to wring out my sleeves and order something hot. He was there, no umbrella, curls soaked, dress shirt clinging to his shoulders, laughing under his breath at a sign that said, "We have decaf. We're not happy about it." That laugh was warm. Like he'd decided to be kind to the world before it deserved it. We started talking because the line was long and the barista kept mixing up drinks. He offered me half of his dry napkins and asked if my heels were a hate crime. He wasn't slick or loud. Just present. He told me he worked in logistics, had a knack for fixing problems that involved too many people and not enough patience. I told him I made brands look bigger than their budgets. We traded stories like we'd been saving them. I was 25 and, in many ways, still my parents' kid. I was their late miracle, the baby after 3 miscarriages and a decade of trying. They treated me with a careful reverence that, depending on the day, felt like a hug or a glass box. They came from a small Texas town where neighbors still showed up uninvited with casseroles and opinions. In their house, doors were never locked and nobody left a kitchen without a to-go bag. My dad's love language was maintenance, new batteries in every smoke detector, oil changes done ahead of schedule, a flashlight by every bed. My mom's was food and phone calls. Did you eat? Did you sleep? Do you need me to send soup? Kieran was the opposite kind of child, firstborn turned invisible. His parents, Joyce and Martin, loved loudly when it came to his younger brother, Kurt. For Kieran, their affection was conditional and mostly logistical, rides to practice if it didn't conflict with Kurt's debate tournament, congratulations if his A came with an explanation of why it wasn't an A+. You were always capable, Joyce would say, admiring Kurt's mess while assigning Kieran the cleanup. By the time I met him, he'd learned the self-containment of boys who raised themselves in occupied houses. We had our first real date the next Saturday. He showed up on time with daisies because he'd overheard me say roses made me feel like I was auditioning for prom. At dinner, he asked questions and listened to answers. No performance, no resume recital. When I told him about being the late baby, how my parents' joy came bundled with fear, he didn't tease. He nodded like he knew the shape of it. We underparent our first ones in my family, he said. If you can do it, you should. If you can't, you should be embarrassed. And if Kurt breathes, it's art. A month in, I brought him to Texas to meet my parents. Back then, they still lived in that same little town. I worried they'd smother him with kindness and casserole, that he'd feel cornered by questions and second helpings. Instead, he folded right into the rhythm like he'd been practicing. He helped my dad retie the clothesline and didn't flinch when my mom insisted he take leftovers and the Pyrex. He called her ma'am once, then Martha the next, and by the end of the weekend she was packing him chili powder in labeled Ziplocs and my dad was showing him where he kept the extra fuses in case the lights go funny. On the drive back to the airport, Kieran stared out at the flat, forgiving horizon and said, very quietly, I didn't know families could be like that. His family was different. We did the obligatory dinner a few weeks later at Joyce and Martin's house, a gleaming museum of cream upholstery and conversation pieces. Joyce opened the door like she'd been interrupted by a delivery. Martin shook my hand as if he were closing on something. Kurt arrived late, kissed his mother's cheek, took my seat without noticing, and asked Kieran for money before the appetizers. Just until Friday, he said, already pocketing the cash. Joyce laughed like it was charming. Martin launched into a story about Kurt's potential, not the past tense, not the present, always the future tense like a balloon you never have to catch. They asked about me the way people ask about weather. Where was I from? Did my parents own or rent? What did my firm bill at? Joyce complimented my dress and then suggested a tailor who could fix that shoulder line. When Kieran mentioned his promotion, Martin turned to Kurt and said, you'd be there already if you wanted it. Every praise for Kieran came with a footnote, every mess of Kurt's was a teachable moment for the universe. I watched Kieran fold himself small at their table, shoulders rounding, jokes dialed down to avoid attracting heat. He had the careful posture of someone who gets punished for taking up space. We learned each other's families like languages. In mine, you called before you came over, then came anyway. You asked twice if someone wanted seconds and served them even if they said no. In his, you announced, you evaluated, you withheld. If Kurt forgot his keys, Joyce drove 40 minutes to let him in and called it support. If Kieran forgot, she said, actions have consequences, and left him on the porch. The double standard wasn't hidden, it was doctrine. He didn't complain about it unless I asked. He'd shrug and say, that's just how it is. But on the nights when Kurt borrowed his car and returned it on empty, when Joyce called to remind him to buy Kurt's daughter a gift from all of us, when Martin introduced him as Kurt's brother to a colleague, he'd show up at my apartment with Thai food and that half smile that meant the edge of him was fraying. We made rituals out of repair. We cooked. We watched dumb shows. I made him take the good pillow. He fixed my wobbly bookshelf and labeled my toolbox like my dad would. He learned the names of my parents' neighbors. He and my dad argued about barbecue technique like it was policy. My mom started texting both of us weather alerts and supermarket coupons. There was a night, our 9th or 10th month together, when he broke the unwritten rule and said the quiet part out loud. We were in my kitchen, I was making boxed brownies because grief and joy both taste better with sugar, and he was leaning against the counter, watching. I love that they ask how you are, he said suddenly. Not what you're producing. Not what you're fixing. Just, how you are. He swallowed. I don't know if I ever got that as a kid. I wiped chocolate off his lip with my thumb and told him he deserved it now. We didn't set out to be a rescue mission for each other, but sometimes love is a steady reparenting. My parents did what they always do when someone joins the family, they adopted him wholesale. Dad taught him how to reseat a toilet float and how to spot a bad spark plug by ear. Mom taught him how to make cornbread that doesn't crumble and how to say no on the phone without apologizing. Kieran, in return, gave them the city, 100 small modernities they'd never cared to learn. He set up my mom's phone to auto-answer only our numbers. He showed my dad how to order hardware online without getting scammed. At Christmas, he bought them a digital frame and loaded it with photos of all of us so the house would keep reminding itself what family looked like. We built a private counterculture. At our table, we celebrated small wins without comparative math. When one of us was tired, the other carried more. On Sundays, we called my parents from the grocery store to read them the cereal aisle like a radio show. On Mondays, if Joyce called to ask whether we were joining the family for dinner, we learned to ask who the family meant and whether joining meant endorsing another bailout for Kurt. We went sometimes. We drew lines often. We paid back loans that were never gifts. We kept receipts, not for court, but for clarity. There were good moments with Joyce and Martin, to be fair. Grief is messy, but so is family. Joyce once brought soup when Kieran had the flu and left it on the porch with a note, "Get well soon." J. Martin congratulated him, sincerely, when he ran his first half marathon. They weren't monsters, they were people who had made a hierarchy and stuck to it so long it felt like truth. Kurt's gravity warped every room. They thought Kieran could carry it because he always had. When we bought the house in Jersey, the one with the creaky steps and the generous morning light, Kieran cried in the empty living room. Not loud. Just this stunned, private relief. "It feels like ours," he said, and I realized how rare that pronoun had been in his life. Ours meant no footnotes, no provisional clauses, no hidden keys under someone else's mat. My parents brought over folding chairs and a cooler and we ate pizza on the floor, our socks blackening with sawdust. Joyce and Martin sent an email about property values and a list of renovations that would elevate the home. We thanked them. We ignored it. We planted tomatoes instead. Over the years, we learned how to hold each other through the whiplash of his family. When Kurt got divorced and moved into Joyce and Martin's guest room, the demands on Kieran doubled: money, time, attention. "You're the stable one," Joyce would say, as if stability were a community fund he could cash out for 3. He struggled with guilt the way firstborns do, guilt for leaving, for succeeding, for saying no. On the nights when the guilt got loud, we went to the river and walked until it quieted. He told me he felt like a safety net strung so tight it had become the trapeze. I told him he could be a fence instead, something that marks a line and protects what's inside. We weren't perfect. We fought about money, about holidays, about how many times we'd say yes before we said no. He slipped into old patterns. I pushed too hard sometimes because I wanted to save him from things he had survived long before me. But we kept coming back to the table. We kept choosing the yes that wasn't conditional on anyone else's approval. When Kieran got sick, the hierarchy in his family turned cruel in a new way. Joyce performed worry-like theater, emails, group texts, sign-up sheets, without ever learning the names of his medications. Martin took meetings and called it staying strong. Kurt cried in our kitchen, borrowed Kieran's truck for errands, and disappeared for 3 days. My parents flew in from Texas and moved in shifts, quietly taking the night watch, mapping out pill times, tucking comfort into the corners of the day. Kieran looked at me one evening, thin and stubborn and still somehow luminous, and said, "If love is measured by who shows up, I won." He did. We did. And when I said goodbye, it was in a home that had been a safe harbor despite the storms outside. I'm telling you all this because people will try to rewrite our story. They'll say I was just the wife on paper, that his family has rights, that grief makes property communal. They'll say past equals claim. But the truth is simpler and harsher. Kieran and I built a life that sheltered him from the cold in his own bloodline. My parents became his parents because they behaved like parents. His house became our house because we paid for it with more than money. And the night they changed my locks, they weren't just breaking a door, they were trying to erase the we he and I fought to make. That's why I didn't fold. That's why I won't. Kieran died on a Wednesday. By then, I had been rehearsing it in my head for months, maybe years. The doctors had been blunt: 2 years of fighting, 2 years of poison through his veins, 2 years of watching his body shrink into the bed that had once been our safe place. He had been brave, more than anyone should ever have to be. And still, when the machines went quiet, I felt the ground disappear beneath me. Grief isn't just sadness. It's weight and silence. It's walking into a room and realizing you'll never hear his laugh there again. It's the smell of his shampoo on the towel and the sting of guilt when you bury your face in it because you're afraid of forgetting. I thought I had prepared. I thought the slow countdown of cancer had built a shield around me. But when Wednesday came, I was a raw nerve, exposed to every sound, every memory, every piece of a life we built that no longer had him in it. My parents were on the first flight from Texas. They didn't ask, they just came. I was their late-in-life miracle, their only child, and they had spent 35 years protecting me from every storm. They couldn't protect me from this one, but they showed up anyway. My father carried my suitcases of sorrow as if they weighed less than air. My mother cooked, even when I didn't eat, because feeding me was the only way she knew how to fight death back. They settled into the guest room and turned my house into a place where survival felt possible. Dad checked the locks every night, not because he thought anyone was coming but because he needed to fix what he could. Mom brewed coffee every morning before I even left the bed, her quiet way of saying, "You are not alone." When I cried, they didn't tell me to stop. When I screamed into the pillow, they closed the door and let me. And when I collapsed in their arms like I was 10 again, they held me without questions. Kieran's family, meanwhile, stayed silent. His mother called once in those first weeks. Just once. She asked what time the service would be and if I needed anything handled. Not how I was, not if I was okay. Just logistics, as if her son's death were another line item on a long, cold list. After that, nothing. No casserole. No flowers. No check-in to see if I was breathing. The only sound from their side was absence, louder than any words. And yet, even in the absence, I could feel their shadow. I could feel the judgment waiting, the claim they would make. Kieran had always been the son who carried his family quietly, while they poured their love into Kurt. Now that Kieran was gone, I sensed it, they would circle back, not with sympathy but with entitlement. I didn't know when. I didn't know how. But I knew. In those first weeks, grief was my whole sky. And my parents were the ground beneath my feet, holding me steady when I couldn't stand alone. It was 2 months after Kieran's funeral when it happened. Grief had settled into something quieter by then, not gone, never gone, but dulled into a rhythm I could survive. I had joined a widow support group on Wednesdays. I would sit in a circle of women and men whose eyes carried the same emptiness mine did, and for an hour I could say his name without anyone flinching. That group was the one place I could breathe without apologizing. On that Wednesday night, I came home to find my parents sitting on the curb. My father's face was pale, a hand pressed to his chest the way he always did when he didn't want me to notice his heart was straining. My mother's arthritis-stiff hands trembled as she clutched her handbag like it was the last piece of dignity she had left. Their suitcases sat beside them on the concrete. Behind them, the lights of my house glowed warm. Shadows moved inside. Laughter drifted out. And I froze, because it was not my parents' laughter. "Sweetheart," my mom whispered when she saw me. "They told us we had to leave." They were Joyce and Martin, Kieran's parents. They had let themselves in while I was gone. No warning. No permission. Just assumption, as if his death had opened the door for them. I ran to the front steps, keys ready, but when I tried the lock it didn't turn. My key, my house, no longer worked. Through the beveled glass, I saw them. Joyce arranging flowers on my dining table, Martin on the phone in my kitchen, his voice smug and loud. And then Kurt, Kieran's younger brother, the golden child who had been coddled through every mistake, lounging in our living room like he belonged there. I pounded on the door. "Open it. Now." Joyce came into view, her face calm, like she was the one inconvenienced. She didn't open the door. She simply tilted her head and mouthed, "We'll talk later." Then she walked away. I turned back to my parents. My father's lips were bluish, his breath shallow. My mother was shivering in her thin jacket. Rage and fear collided in my chest. I wrapped my arms around them, swearing to myself that I would never let this happen again. The neighbors peeked from across the street. One kind woman hurried over with a blanket, whispering, "What's going on?" Shame burned my throat as I answered, "They changed my locks." That night was more than a betrayal. It was a declaration of war. Because Joyce and Martin weren't just locking me out of my own home, they were trying to erase the life Kieran and I had built, to claim the pieces of him that weren't theirs to touch. And as I held my trembling parents under the streetlight, I realized something chilling. They thought I was too broken to fight back. But they were wrong. That night we didn't sleep in my home. A kind neighbor offered us her guest room, and though I lay down in a strange bed, my mind never left the porch where my parents had been shivering. By morning, anger had cut through the fog. I gathered the documents I still had, our mortgage agreement, the insurance papers, every scrap of proof that the house was mine as much as it had been Kieran's. I called a friend from my grief group who was an attorney and begged her for advice. Her answer was blunt, "They don't have a legal leg to stand on." "But Bree, you can't reason with people who believe entitlement is law. You'll need backup." By noon, I was standing in front of my own house again, this time with a police officer at my side and a locksmith unrolling his tools. My parents watched from the car, fragile but hopeful. My neighbor leaned on her porch railing, ready to testify if needed. The officer glanced at the paperwork in my hand, then nodded. "You're the legal owner. We'll make sure this goes smoothly." The locksmith set to work, the drill biting into the lock. The sound was harsh, metallic, but to me, it was liberation. Of course, Joyce appeared before the new lock clicked into place. She swept down the stairs like a queen interrupted, Martin at her shoulder, Kurt still sprawled on the sofa inside as if nothing was wrong. "This is family property," Joyce snapped. "You can't just barge in with strangers." The officer's tone was even. "Ma'am, the deed is in Bree's name. You have no legal claim here." Joyce's face froze, then cracked into rage. "We were protecting our son's legacy." "No," I said, stepping forward, my voice steady now. "You were trying to erase mine. And Kieran's. This house is ours, his and mine. You lost the right to call it yours when you locked out the people who actually loved him." Martin barked something about betrayal, about family ties, but I barely heard him. Because at that moment, the locksmith handed me a new set of keys. Cold metal. Heavy with justice. I slipped one into the door, turned it, and pushed it open. The house was mine again. But what I found inside proved this was only the beginning. Joyce's clothes hanging in the guest room closet, her creams lined up on the bathroom counter, and, on the desk in my husband's office, a change of address form with my address already filled in under Joyce and Martin Cunningham. This wasn't just invasion. It was a takeover. A plan. And I knew, as I stood in the home I had reclaimed, that the real fight was only beginning. The smell of legal paper and stale coffee clung to the air. My attorney had chosen a neutral office downtown, a place where emotions couldn't hide but also couldn't explode unchecked. That was the point. Keep everything on the record. Keep everything under control. I sat at one end of the polished oak table with my lawyer beside me. Across from us sat Joyce, spine straight as if a ruler ran through her body, Martin with his jaw clenched and arms crossed, and Kurt slouched in his chair like a bored teenager. They looked at me like I was the intruder, as if I hadn't already lived in this house for years, as if they hadn't tried to shove my parents onto the curb like trash. My lawyer opened the meeting without preamble. "This isn't complicated. The property deed is in Bree's name. With her husband's passing, she inherits his share. By law, the house is hers outright. Your lock change, your occupation of the home, those were unlawful." Joyce's smile was thin, her pearls catching the fluorescent light. "We weren't occupying. We were safeguarding our son's legacy. Surely you understand, Bree, you wouldn't want Kieran's memory tarnished." Something inside me snapped, but I forced my voice to stay calm. "Don't you dare use his memory as an excuse. You didn't even come to our wedding. You visited once during chemo. My parents sat through every treatment, every night of pain. They were his family. Not you. Martin leaned forward, his voice booming across the table. Watch your tone. We are his blood. You can't erase that. No, I said, leaning forward too. But you erased yourselves when you locked out my sick father and shivering mother. That wasn't protection. That was cruelty. Kurt finally spoke, his tone lazy. You're overreacting. The house is too big for you anyway. I could move in, bring my kid, make it a real family place. Kieran would have wanted that. I turned to him, ice in my voice. Don't you dare pretend to know what Kieran would have wanted. He wanted me safe. He wanted my parents close. He wanted peace. And you, all of you, are the opposite of peace. My lawyer slid a folder across the table. Inside were photos, Joyce's clothes hanging in the guest room, her skincare bottles in the bathroom, the half-completed change of address form listing my house as their residence. The silence was deafening. This isn't a misunderstanding, my lawyer said flatly. It's evidence of intent. Evidence of an attempted takeover. If necessary, we can present it in court along with medical reports documenting the harm caused to Bree's elderly parents. In legal terms, that's elder endangerment. The words landed like a bomb. Serious. Damaging. Not just to them in court, but in their precious social circles where reputation was currency. Joyce's mask cracked first. Her face flushed, and her voice lost its silk. This is outrageous. We were only. Enough, Martin barked. We'll fight this in court if we have to. My lawyer didn't blink. You're welcome to try. But you'll lose. I looked at them, one by one. Joyce pale now, Martin fuming, Kurt smirking as if he still didn't understand the gravity of what was happening. And I felt something shift. For the first time since Kieran died, I wasn't just surviving. I was standing. You tried to erase me, I said quietly. You tried to erase my parents. But you forgot something, this house, this life, this love, Kieran and I built it together. And you can't take that away with locks or lies. The silence stretched until even Kurt fidgeted. Finally, Joyce whispered, What do you want, Bree? I held their gaze, steady as stone. Your signatures on those papers. Your admission that this house is mine. And your promise you'll never step into my home without my consent again. My lawyer placed the written terms on the table. Sign these, and we move forward quietly. Refuse, and we file. The papers lay between us like a verdict. For the first time, they weren't in control. I was. It took months of paperwork, signatures, and silence heavy as stone. But the house is mine again. Fully. Legally. Beyond dispute. Joyce and Martin signed the agreement my lawyer drafted, their names shaking on the page. They hated every second of it, but they had no choice. They gave up all claims to the house, agreeing never to step inside without my permission. I didn't take them to court for elder endangerment, though part of me wishes I had. The word spread anyway, and in their world, reputation was everything. Invitations dried up. Their circle shrank. The people they had wanted to impress most quietly turned their backs. Kurt drifted on, aimless as ever, his promises as empty as his glass. He stopped calling once he realized I would never bankroll his fresh start. For the first time, I wasn't the one carrying someone else's chaos. That weight is gone. My parents are back where they belong, under my roof, in the guest room Kieran and I had chosen for them years ago. Dad tends the tomato plants Kieran once planted, and Mom fills the kitchen with the smell of cornbread. When I hear their laughter echo through the house, I know this is what family sounds like. I still miss Kieran every day. That will never change. But the house no longer feels haunted by absence. It feels claimed. Protected. Ours. What I learned is this: revenge doesn't always look like fire. Sometimes it looks like a locked door, a signed paper, a safe place where love can live without fear. Sometimes revenge is simply keeping what was always yours, and refusing to let anyone take it. So if you've ever been pushed out of your own life, told you were too weak to fight back, remember this. You don't need their permission. You don't need their approval. You only need the truth, and the strength to stand on it.